Well, thank you very much. There were no mistakes at all in that introduction, and follows very nicely on a number of things that I'm going to try to elaborate on in the talk. By way of framing this in the context of AU 2030, I think you'll all be familiar. The AU 2030 is the concept that the provost put forth maybe a year or two ago, asking the university community to imagine what AU would look like close to 20 years from now, the next generation of AU, and with a particular concern with what might be some particular fields in which we would be seen as particularly world-class, what might be some of the kinds of boutique programs that we would have developed and that would be the sort of signatures of the AU brand, of AU's identity. And so that idea only came up after, a couple years after, we had set up the center. But the center can be seen as one sort of initiative that might fit in that overall kind of agenda of identifying areas of strategic excellence. And again, the most recent of which being the gaming, but there's discussion around campus, around metropolitan studies, around neuroscience, and so on. And in a sense, what we tried to do with Latin American and Latino studies can be seen as an initial foray in this direction. A word about the basic purposes of the center is we wanted to emphasize its role as a research as a driver of research, as a space that would facilitate research on campus. In this sense, it's somewhat different from most of the regionally defined or ethnically defined centers across American higher education. I would argue that the regional centers typically arose after the Second World War as the United States was looking to generate new generations of experts on different parts of the world where, for geopolitical reasons, the U.S. Had an important stake in understanding societies, cultures, politics, economics, and so on. And so these institutions were very much focused on the task of training area experts, right? And I think you could make the case, it's the subject of a different presentation, that after the end of the Cold War, that left those centers with a bit of a lack of mission. And I would argue as well a lack of an intellectual agenda. And I think we were very fortunate to be able to set up the regionally defined part of this, the Latin America piece, long after that paradigm had passed. And instead of seeing it as a way to generate on campus the basic cultural and historical expertise about parts of the world, we would see it as a way of driving the research mission of the university. In the same way with regard to the Latino Studies side of this. Ethnic studies programs typically came out of identity politics and struggles for recognition of the 1960s and ensuing decades. Again, that wasn't where our program was coming from. Our program was coming from the observation that in a society in which 50 million people are of Latino origin, in which that number is increasing rapidly, it's important for that segment of the population and its concerns, the characteristics of that population, to be front and center in the intellectual agenda of the university, the knowledge production agenda of the university. And so all this by way of saying that our primary goal was to promote research excellence, and that that's not typically what area and ethnic studies programs do around the United States. Now, in order to do that, we wanted to increase resources for research. So we wanted good research, and we wanted resources from outside the university that would help to make that research possible. And as with the 2030 initiatives, we were very determined that the programs that we developed would raise the profile of the university around the country, and for that matter, around the world, and highlight the degree to which truly innovative research and creative activities were taking place at AU, the extent to which this was a go-to place for knowledge in the areas that fell under our purview. And that meant that we also had to think very creatively about how we would disseminate the results of the work that we do. It's one thing and an important thing to publish academic press books and to publish in the right journals, but if you want society to know about what you're doing, you need to get your message out in other venues as well. For many colleges and universities, what you do to generate reputation is have high-profile national sports teams, right? But we don't do that, or not to the same degree. And so we need to have many different ways in which our message gets out and reaches different constituencies across society. So the way in which we do our work is unique in the sense that the center, as John mentioned, is a campus-wide entity. Most of the other actually all of the other centers that are operating at AU at the moment function administratively within a single unit, a single school or college. And this was an effort very intentionally to develop a program that was campus-wide in its scope. And so we work with each of the schools and colleges, and actually increasingly with key administrative units around campus, to both design and implement the programs that we develop. And one of the things, again, as John suggested, is that we have recruited faculty from around campus, but in addition to faculty from around campus, we have tried to incorporate individuals from other institutions. And sometimes that involves people spending periods of time here on a Fulbright, or one of the people here, Daniel Azevedo, is here completing a dissertation in Rio de Janeiro, so he's here on a fellowship doing his doctoral research. And so we bring in addition to faculty and doctoral students from around campus, bringing in people from other institutions as well. And the overall objective is to strengthen the university through innovation, but innovation of the sorts that I mentioned a moment ago on the previous slide with regard to research, but also with regard to how we get the message out about what we do. Just a quick review of where the faculty come from. And I probably should have generated a slide that would do a similar depiction of the doctoral students. We've got about 15 doctoral students who are formally affiliated with the center and do various sorts of work with us. But with regard to the faculty, these are the numbers at the end of 2013, and people come and go, so there may be 77 or 73 now, but at the time of this, it was 75. You'll see primarily from CAS and SIS, but with a smattering of people from other units on campus as well. And I would say that of those 75, 65 are specialists on Latin America, and around 10 have interest in Latino Studies issues. And one of the challenges that we face, and this is something we knew going in, was that our expertise on campus is for largely coincidental reasons much greater and in fact exceptional on Latin America than it is, at least in terms of scale, on Latinos. Now, in addition to faculty, we have approximately 15 fellows at any given time. Most of the fellows come for a semester or come for a year. This is just an example of 4 of them. And they either are carrying out their own research, or at times they're participating in research programs that are underway under the auspices of the center. The people who are up there, I'll highlight a couple that exemplify the mode of work where a fellow comes in and works very centrally on an ongoing initiative. Fulton Armstrong, who's the first person pictured there, has worked over the years for a number of government agencies, including really the most senior intelligence positions on Latin America, was also John Kerry's principal staffer on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and decided that he was done with that and wanted a little more intellectual space. And so Fulton moved into the center and has been there now for over 2 years. And he works with us on a variety of policy research programs. He also directs the blog that we produce and that comes out twice a week or sometimes 3 times a week. I'll say something about it in a moment. And that's been funded by the Open Society Foundations, and I think part of it is likely to be funded by the Tinker Foundation down the road. And that's something that we see as an ongoing relationship, whereas many of the fellows come for shorter periods of time. Similarly, the person at the bottom of the screen, Hector Silva, is one of the most prominent investigative journalists in Latin America, who spent a couple of years here in Washington as the deputy chief of mission in the Salvadoran embassy, and then decided that he wanted to go back to his work as an investigative journalist who writes books. Given what he's writing books about, it would not be prudent for him to write them in his native country, and therefore Open Society Foundations funded him to spend a period as a research scholar with us. He produced a book. It's a splendid book. It's coming out next month. It's already been presented at the United Nations, at various other, in various other venues. And we now have a large grant from the National Institute of Justice that will support him over the next couple years as part of a team of fellows and faculty who will be studying the structure of gangs in both the United States and in Central America. So those are 2 examples. There are others of fellows who have appointments that are indeterminate in terms of how long they may be with us. I'm going to say something in a few moments about the projects that we've developed, but first let me mention that we've tried very hard to generate partnerships with institutions where our projects are either developed jointly or where elements of our projects are disseminated in partnership with those institutions. And so on this page, you'll see partnerships that we have in Central America and the Caribbean. On the next page, partnerships that we have in South America. These are instances where the relationships are quite formal. I should say that there are many informal relationships as well. So where we have particular projects and scholars from institutions in countries other than those that are mentioned here come to the campus and take part. Now I realize that I've missed in this slide an indication of the institutional partnerships largely here in Washington around Latino studies issues. And let me say, without the benefit of a slide, a few words about that. We have done a number of things together with the National Council on La Raza, NCLR. In fact, the previous slide of research fellows included Patricia Foxon, who's the director of research there and has been involved with us in a number of initiatives around discrimination. We have also collaborated with the Latino Economic Development Council here in Washington, D.C., and we are now launching a collaboration with the Small Business Technology Development Council of Maryland and a nonprofit called BizNet in Fairfax County that work with Latino entrepreneurs around a project directed by Barbara Bird, who's in the last row, and one of the affiliated faculty from Kogod School of Business. We've also developed projects with Centronia, which is a charter school and social service agency in Columbia Heights that largely serves Latino populations here in Washington. So here again, what we were determined to do was to generate a Center for Latin American and Latino Studies that is for a regional and ethnically defined program that would not solely be focused on the campus community, on the university, but that instead would reach out to stakeholders across the world, across the country, and in the Washington area. John mentioned in the introduction that we've been relatively successful securing external support, and this was certainly absolutely central to the charge that Provost Bass gave to us at the very outset, nearly 4 years ago now. We were reasonably confident that we could secure some support. But I frankly think that we've done better than I expected that we would. This is a list of the principal agencies that have funded us. In several instances, they've funded us with multiple grants for multiple projects. And you can see that in this, which perhaps is too small to see. I'll highlight some of these that are particularly noteworthy and that will give you, well, I'll highlight them in the next slide. Let me just say one thing about this slide, which again, it's possible you can't see. What this is a list of grants from 2010, which we got started in March of 2010. And by got started, I should say, that meant we started discussing what should we call this? Should we buy a desk? These kinds of things. If we hire someone on the staff, what is their position? We get HR to create the position. These things don't just happen with a snap of the fingers. And one of the things I'm going to conclude this talk with is suggestion of some of the lessons for future 2030 projects and similar. And one of them is, there's a lot of just heavy lifting to get things off the ground. Really basic stuff like, what are you going to call it? And do you have a staff? And do you have business cards and letterhead and all those sorts of things? So in the 4 years since we've got started, what this does is highlight grants received 2010, 11, 12. And the key message is that during 2010, we only got a little bit of seed funding. We were spending most of the time trying to figure out, trying to get telephones, trying to get computers hooked up, that sort of thing. But in the first 2 years where we were really up and running, 2011 and 2012, we brought in roughly $500,000 a year in grants. However, if you then move ahead to 2013, you see our ability to really ramp up. And we were able to secure, during that calendar year, around $1.7 million in external grant funds. And so that brought our total over the period to date of around $2.75 million. We also had, at the end of the last year, several proposals pending. One that is especially important and that we still don't know whether we will secure is a contract of nearly $6 million to work across this campus with universities in El Salvador to strengthen the higher education system in that country. So what I'm trying to illustrate with these slides is that there was a gradual progression to where now we are putting forth a higher volume of larger proposals and overall experiencing, I think, considerable success with those. Let me just back up for a moment and say some things about some of these foundations and some of what they're supporting. And what I'll do next is talk about, I'll give you brief vignettes of some illustrative projects. The Christopher Reynolds Foundation has been supporting a variety of initiatives that we've pulled together and called a Cuba initiative, involving people in SIS, SPA, COGOD, CAS, and the law school, and the School of Communication, with regard to activities in Cuba. And this has largely focused around diplomatic relations between Cuba and the United States and Cuba and the rest of Latin America. That's mostly the SPA and some of the SIS people. Economic development in Cuba, which has largely been my work, but some others on campus as well. Filmmaking in Cuba, in SOC. And a variety of initiatives around Cuban culture and around, Cuban culture and also students going back and forth and faculty going back and forth from CAS. And finally, work in health and in education involving faculty in SIS and in COGOD. Faculty in COGOD who are working on social marketing and health messages. And we're working very closely with colleagues in Cuba. And so this has involved moving faculty back and forth, providing seed money for the research, workshops, seminars, both here and in Cuba. There's also been some work with the law school involving WCL and the University of Havana Law School in seminars around gender and sexuality in the law. and about how you introduce issues of gender and sexuality into law school curricula. And from the point of view of the Christopher Reynolds Foundation, that piece is especially important in that no other U.S. university has managed to be allowed to speak with the University of Havana Law School. And we have managed to get in that door. We've had faculty going there every year. This is very politically complicated in Cuba. And from their point of view, from the funders' point of view, this is a major contribution. From our point of view, it's very exciting for faculty to have these possibilities to move back and forth. Ford Foundation has been the principal source of support for a project I'll describe in a few moments around what we call the reconfiguration of elites and political power in Central America. And the argument, in a nutshell, is that the structure of Central American economies transformed fundamentally over the last 30 years. And the ways in which the social science literature had understood Central America's highly unequal and exclusionary political systems was that they emerged from a particular economic structure that was conducive to generating such exclusionary systems. But if that economic structure has been transformed, turned upside down, then what does that mean for what we know as social scientists about how power is exercised? And the answer is social scientists have not understood how power is exercised in the 21st century in that part of the world. And through a succession of grants now totaling around $500,000 from Ford, we have commissioned more than 40 very closely integrated studies of how Central American political economy is evolving. We've had very high-profile public events in the region and outside. We are completing now 4 volumes that will be published, and that we'll have a traveling show through Central America of those books. And we also have an electronic book that will follow, and we're going to work on a single high-profile university press book for the US. So that's a project we feel very good about. We think it's first-rate social science. I think that anywhere in the world now where you find somebody who's known as a specialist on Central American political economy, and you ask them, where is the initiative that will most matter for this decades of research, they'll tell you it's the American University Project. And so in that sense, I think it's a successful case where we've been able to foreground AU for its expertise. The Henry Luce Foundation has supported 2 projects, one that just completed and one that's just getting underway, through its program on religion and international affairs. And one of those projects looks at the question of how, under authoritarian regimes, under dictatorships, characterized by widespread human rights abuses, and we're talking here largely in the 1960s through 80s, there is fairly broad understanding of the role that religious actors, churches, played in defending, or sometimes not defending, victims of human rights and advocating on their behalf. There's a lot more research that could be done, but there was a general notion, and we did some more research to advance that understanding. But we wanted to ask a related question, which was, in addition to looking at that question, what do religious actors do vis-a-vis violence today in Latin America under democratic regimes where arguably there's more violence than there was under the dictatorships, right? And so we have completed a 15-chapter volume that I think will be accepted by the University of Notre Dame Press very soon. It will come out simultaneously in Spanish with Flaxo Mexico, the leading social science publisher in Mexico. But we've also done policy white papers and briefed people in U.S. government and Organization of American States and Inter-American Development Bank circles who are thinking about what are the tools available to policymakers that can help them to grapple with violence and its consequences in the region. We've also convened a 3-day retreat of 40 seminarians, or 40 pastoral activists, largely priests and evangelical preachers, in Guatemala City to explore how their ministries deal with violence and why. And it was an absolutely fascinating meeting. And one of our policy white papers is a reflection on that meeting, unfortunately only in Spanish at this point. We've also, out of that project, working with Bill Gentile in the School of Communication, done what I think are some fantastic YouTube documentaries about the research, specifically focused on what is known as the religious exemption in Latin America today, where, as you know, there are very active and violent urban youth gangs. And once you're in a gang, you can't leave, except for one thing. If you give yourself to God and join an evangelical church. In many of the gang cliques, that is an accepted, negotiated between religious authorities and gang leaders. Now, of course, you're monitored, and if gang leaders determine that you were faking it, you're in bad shape, you're in trouble. But in many instances, the exemption, the religious exemption, is holding. And so Gentile follows our researchers and the former gang members and the preachers trying to figure out how this works. Right? It's really exciting stuff. Quickly, National Institute of Justice is another project on gangs, led by two of our research fellows and Ed McGuire, professor in the Justice Law and Criminology project. And that's going to study from the inside the structure of some of the key Latino gangs here and in Central America. That's a very substantial grant received late last year. Open Society Foundations, this is George Soros' network of foundations, have supported a variety of things, largely associated with the Fellows Program. Also our website and team of journalists who focus on organized crime. IDRC, the International Development Research Council of Canada. I'll pass that one in the interest of time. And also the Inter-American Development Bank. Inter-American Development Bank has just funded us to join with a think tank in Chile, which is a regional think tank, an economic policy think tank, in a series of studies looking at the future challenges facing Latin America's economies, and in that context, the implications for strategic directions of the Inter-American Development Bank's work over the coming decade. The piece that we're doing at AU is specifically looking at some of the ramifications of Latin America's growing integration in trans-Pacific production networks and investment and capital flow networks. So those are some illustrations. Let me say a little bit more about some of the most important visible projects. I described the Elites in Power project briefly. Let me say a little bit more about it. It's involved several faculty here on campus. It has involved a fair number of opportunities for research assistants for graduate students around campus. And it has included, I would say, about 1/3 or so researchers from US and European institutions, almost all of them recognized experts specifically on Central American political economy, although in some instances there'll be people who are known as theorists in a particular area that is shaping some of the empirical studies that we're carrying out, and roughly 2/3 of the participants drawn from institutions in the region. And the partnerships that we've developed formally have been with two institutions. The Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences, which has several campuses. Our principal partner has been the one in Costa Rica, and the Jesuit University in Guatemala City. But many of the participating researchers are coming as individuals from other institutions. The project on religion and violence, and again I gave you a bit of a description of that a moment ago, and I don't know whether you can see the text from where you're sitting. But this project is one that has given rise now to a new Luce funded project, Luce Foundation funded project, which again is part of the Religion and International Affairs program of that foundation, where what we're looking at is how religion engages some of the most remarkable areas of contestation, of social conflict, of democratic debate in Latin America today. And as a political scientist myself who studies democratic regimes in Latin American democracy, if I look back 15, 20 years ago, in the early phases of the most recent democratic transitions, and you were to have asked me what in 20 years are going to be the principal, most striking areas of contestation, I would not have come up with natural resources and environmental movements, except that across the region, this is at the core of whether countries are governable. If you want to understand, can the Peruvian government not be a complete failure? It's can they manage the incredibly intense conflicts around natural resources and the environment? Well, those conflicts, religion is engaged. Religion can't avoid those key conflicts in democracy. So one of the areas we're looking at in this project, which the initial planning seminar is going to take place Thursday and Friday here at AU with about a dozen researchers from around the hemisphere and AU researchers. One element of it will be to look at democratic conflicts around the environment. The other, which would really have surprised us, although with the new Pope perhaps it shouldn't, given some of the things that he has said, is around gender and sexuality. We would not have expected that evolving views of things like gay marriage would be increasingly widespread in Latin American democracies. The debates about abortion rights, the debates about gender violence, debates about same-sex adoption, we could go on and on and on. These are very hot topics. And so again, the question is, how are the churches engaging this? Are they evolving? In what ways? What are the disputes within the churches? So this is something we're getting underway. And the principal investigators on that will be Evan Barry in the Religious Studies Department, Philosophy and Religion Department, and Macarena Saiz in the law school. And so this is, again, an instance where we're bringing together different units around campus around what we think is going to be some really exciting and important research activities. The project, the NIJ-funded project on gangs, again, will involve McGuire and SPA and fellows located in the center. McGuire has done a lot of work with gangs and law enforcement, largely in the Caribbean, trying to get a sense of how gangs are structured, how they are financed, and the kinds of activities they carry out, where, when, why. The two fellows in our center have done quite a bit of work with Central American gangs, including in prisons. And this is actually important because some of the more important gangs operating in the United States are actually managed out of prisons in Central America, right? It's not the Department of Corrections that runs prisons in Central America. The gangs run the prisons. And so if you want to understand how MS-13, which the United States government has labeled a transnational terrorist organization, is operating in suburban Washington, D.C., where it is a very active, important organization, you actually have to get inside the prisons in Salvador. And so we are going to be carrying out this research over 2 years with gang members here in Washington, gang members in Los Angeles, some gang members in prisons in the United States, generally in the areas of LA or California and the Middle Atlantic here in the US, and also in the streets and in the jails in Central America. And that project is just getting underway. We are looking forward to what the IRB is going to say to the proposal that is going in tomorrow morning for how we are going to protect human subjects in this very sensitive stuff. That has kept us busy the last few days. But we're very confident that this is going to be a path-breaking study. National Institute of Justice, which is funding it, is extremely enthusiastic about it. We're very much looking forward to it. Another project that is addressing the Latino Studies mandate of the center is a project that looks at the health and educational development, more generally the psychosocial welfare, of U.S. citizen children who have a parent deported. And some of you may know that more than 250,000 people deported during the Obama administration are parents of U.S. citizen children. And you probably also know that in most instances, the only violation of those people are immigration violations. So we have a huge problem in the United States, or at least we hypothesize this is a problem. Maybe it doesn't matter. We hypothesize that it matters when children have parents deported. And we're drawing on literature that Kim Blankenship, the chair of the sociology department in the Center on Health, Risk, and Society, has been working with, looking at the impact of mass incarceration on African American communities and on children in African American communities. And our hypothesis is that the dynamic in Latino communities is increasingly analogous, that the mass deportation of Latinos over the last decade is creating, we suspect, circumstances for Latino kids that are analogous to what is taking place in the African American community. And so we're launching a study that will look at groups of children whose parents have been deported and have gone back to the country of origin with the child, with the parent, that the child, U.S. citizen child, has accompanied them. Similar sized group of parents who were deported and the child stays behind, either with family or in foster care or with family friends. And then another group of people who have not been deported but are in high vulnerability of deportation. There's a series of hypotheses that we've generated from what literature there is about these communities, that the high levels of uncertainty, what we call deportability, are themselves highly destabilizing. And so we're carrying out this research here at AU, people in the psychology department, sociology department, and in the center. I think this is one where we will collaborate with people in the law school and who have connected us with networks of immigration lawyers. We're also very much in contact with the National Council on La Raza, which is concerned about advocacy issues around these questions. And so this is a project, again, that we think is really important. We think it speaks to key issues of interest well beyond the university at the same time that it draws on state-of-the-art academic research. The final one of the research projects that I'll mention is the one that Barbara Bird of the Kogat School of Business has been working on. And this is a project that tries to understand how do Latino entrepreneurs approach the task of planning their businesses. And this came out of our conversations with business service providers who indicated to us that their sense was that one of the biggest problems their clients, Latino clients, were facing had to do with the ways in which they planned their firms, the evolution of their firms. And so we've launched a pilot here in DC, and we're now spreading out to Fairfax County and suburban Maryland, to try to get a sense of, in fact, how are different groups of migrants, of Latinos in different kinds of firms approaching the task of planning their enterprises. I'll skip the next slide. This is just one of the projects we have that's finished. It highlights that there's a book on institutions for political participation, and it highlights that one of the products are academic press books. And so this is a book that Palgrave Macmillan did, simultaneously came out in Mexico. What I'm now going to turn to is the dissemination side, because I outlined at the beginning of my talk that we wanted to do cutting-edge work, highly visible work, but we also wanted to make sure that we weren't only distributing this through the conventional academic channels of journals and books. We care about those, but that's not the entire challenge. So this is just a list of 5 vehicles. One, Latin Pulse, is a weekly podcast and radio show coordinated by Rick Rockwell in the School of Communication, but drawing on students and on research fellows and faculty associated with the center on contemporary Latin American affairs. The weekly show is now done around 125, so it's been going on a little more than 2 years, and we're up now to around 110,000 downloads a week. And that's quite striking. And you get it on iTunes, you get it on SoundCloud, whatever. So you take those all together, we're getting over 110, pushing 120,000 per week. Insight Crime is an organization run by a research fellow at the center who's one of Latin America's most prominent journalists. He's an American, but a very prominent journalist. And the person who was the BBC's Latin America correspondent based in Medellin, Colombia. And from AU and from Colombia, they run what is the largest research and analysis operation anywhere on organized crime in Latin America. And so you will have seen Chapo Guzman's arrest in Mexico a couple days ago. What was the first place that people went to was Insight Crime. Insight Crime's website receives now over 100,000 views a month. It is the first place that journalists go to. It is the first place that policy people go to, et cetera. The blog is a venue for commentary, quick analysis, sharp analysis. We call it sometimes non-gratuitous provocation, to try to shake up conventional understandings about U.S.-Latin American relations or about Latin America. It's a play on word, Aula blog, A-U-L-A, AU Latin America, but Aula is also a classroom or a laboratory. And so the Aula blog, and we've been doing that for a couple years. Facebook, we're around 4,000 people who like us on Facebook. When we put stuff up, it gets out there, it goes viral. We have, in the Andean region of Latin America, for reasons that I don't know, we have 1,000 Facebook followers. And stuff comes out from our accounts and it starts bouncing through all these other social media platforms that I don't really understand. Anyway, in the interest of time, I won't go further. I've said a little bit about these. Latin Pulse, the blog. A Visuals Archive here with the library is a collaboration where we have set up an online searchable archive of images that can be used for books, they can be used in classroom presentations, and so on. Election Passport is a database of electoral outcomes in 80 countries, including all Latin American Caribbean countries, developed with David Lublin of SPA. Assessment of progress. I'm going to conclude with a couple slides here. First, I'm satisfied that we've managed to sustain the quality levels that I was determined that we sustain, that I think are essential for the brand of the center and for AU. I'm reasonably satisfied with our abilities in terms of generating outside resources, though there's more to go. With visibility as well, particularly in light of the various dissemination strategies that I've mentioned. Impact, I'm less certain. I think we don't, and by we I don't only mean the center, we don't really understand how to measure impact. I don't know how much it matters that we have 4,000 people that connect to us with Facebook, or that we get 110,000 downloads or something. It's an interesting indicator, but to really make the argument that we're changing the world, not easy to do. Some of our challenges, sustaining the constant generation of new ideas, diversifying funding sources, which includes, I think, as a next step in the center's development, attracting individual donors. And I think that we also need to continually try to deliver on our aspiration to serve multiple constituencies. That is to say, to do things that matter for scholarship, to do things that matter for students, to do things that matter for users of knowledge around the country and around the world. A handful of lessons for future 2030 efforts. First, you have to have buy-in from faculty and from the leadership of units with which you're working. I think we've been very fortunate in that regard. I frequently say that we have 75 faculty, and more than half of them really do work. They really do stuff. And that is higher than you would find at virtually any analogous institution around the country. I think it's very important that you clearly articulate your brand and your agenda. This would be something that I would highlight, I would stress to any of you thinking of developing the 2030 initiatives. Your brand and agenda as you project them both to campus and to the broader outside world. You have to be very strategic about how you target funders and how you engage funders. Different kinds of funding institutions require different sorts of approaches, but you have to go into this process with a very clear strategy of how you're going to go about that. That's related to your communication strategy, particularly if you're going to try to get private philanthropic support. If you don't have a way of convincing them that you have communication strategies that are going to get the findings of the work they support to constituencies they care about, you're not going to have that conversation. And finally, this is something, again, very, very important. You have to have adequate staff. When I look around AU, I see people trying to start or sustain initiatives without adequate staff. Graduate students are fantastic people, but you can't sustain a center with using your MA graduate assistant. It just doesn't work. And if you try to do it, what will happen is that you'll have a website that gets updated every 3 years, and it just doesn't look dynamic. And you're not going to be able to fulfill an ambitious agenda. You've got to staff it well. And that's certainly a challenge. That's all I'll say for now. I went longer than I was supposed to. Lene. Okay, sorry, Lene. Yes?
So, some of this seems iterative and opportunistic in the very best way. And I assume that there was a process when you gathered the 75 faculty to discover where is the resonance. Mm-hmm. Can you help me understand a little bit more than how did you clearly articulate a brand and agenda knowing that some of it was developing?
This is a really good question. First thing I did when I got here, aside from trying to figure out how to make it so that we could have the computer and the microwave plugged in the place where we were in McKinley, aside from that, was to meet with everybody on the faculty who I thought might become an affiliate and spend an hour, what are you working on? And have them send me their writings beforehand. I would read what they were doing, and just really try to get an understanding of what everybody was doing. And always thinking about it, and I still do that. I go back to faculty all the time. What are your new projects? What are you doing? So that I'm always then on the lookout for connections across campus. And I've brought people together in joint projects. They never knew they were on the same campus. So I'm always trying to do that. And also so that as I circulate among funders, which is a lot of my job, I always have my ears open. When they say, we need understanding of X, I can say, actually, I know who you need to talk to, right? I was in New York 2 weeks ago with Todd Eisenstadt in the government department to meet with a program officer at the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And I talked to that guy every 8 or 10 months, and he started talking about their work with civil society around climate change activism. Well, Todd just got a $500,000 grant from the NSF to look at public opinion around, so he invites us to come and visit, and that may lead somewhere, right? That speaks a bit to the opportunistic question. We're always trying to get a handle on what sorts of things are there support for. And if we learn of things that are interesting, important, they've got to be interesting, that are consistent with the mission of an organization such as ours, which is committed to generating knowledge and figuring out how to disseminate knowledge, then we try to put together those pieces of that puzzle. The other thing I would say in terms of how we got the mission and the brand was partly what are we able to do? What do we have here that we're doing or we want to do? Partly where are the resources? But it was also partly if we want to say that we are addressing the great issues of the day, what are the things we actually can't not pay attention to? And if some such things come to mind, we have to then figure out how to get the people, how to generate the resources. Does that help?
Yes. Follow-up?
Yeah.
Scope creep.
Yeah, we have been, I think, successful with that. By scope creep, you mean finding that you end up trying to do too many different kinds of things and get distracted from your core mission. Let me give you an example of a place where there's a risk. And it is also, at the same time, a risk we chose to take, and it's something I didn't mention, but it exemplifies part of what we want to do. The USAID project that I mentioned in passing, we responded to a request for bids from USAID for a program that would, over a 5-year period, work with anywhere between 6 and 8 Salvadoran higher education institutions to try to transform them, make them better, train their faculty with graduate degrees here, help them set up offices of institutional research, career centers. Jihan Fernando was very much involved in putting that together. And so we put together at the center a program that would bring probably around 75 Salvadoran faculty members to do graduate studies at AU, not in our unit, to learn how to set up career centers in Salvadoran universities, to learn how to work with the private sector to shape curricula for skills development. That's not part of our core mission, right? But I saw it as worth doing because I want the center to, as part of its campus-wide identity, strengthen AU, provide resources across AU, enable AU units to do things that they have not in the past been able to do, in part because we tend to operate in siloed fashion, and we're in a unique space where we do work across units, and so we can take advantage of that, that institutional location to try to catalyze things that wouldn't otherwise happen. But the risk is, in fact, scope creep. I hadn't used that term, but that's exactly right. Yeah.
If I may
Yes, Scott.
make a comment rather than a question, Eric, is I indeed hired Eric almost 4 years ago through a lengthy process and had laid out an ambitious agenda, which in fact one of the things he did mention, as I said, that we want the center to be among the top 5 institutes in the United States within 5 years. And I've said it privately, but I want to say publicly, that Eric has far exceeded those goals. This is a premier institution in America. He has led it, he's involved faculty. There isn't a unit on campus, an individual that he's not touched base with. And we're just very, very proud of what he has done. He's advanced the issues that he cares about. He's engaged the faculty, and he's brought great pride to the institution. I want to compliment Eric publicly for his achievements.
I appreciate that, Scott, very much. And as I've also said, we have had overwhelming support from across campus since we set out on this task. And the enthusiasm, the willingness to contribute time, very busy people who've been willing to come on board and help make this happen. And increasingly, this was a challenge for AU. AU never had a campus-wide entity that was building some of the kinds of things we were building. And so there was a lot of growing pains through the first couple years of just, how do you do that? How do you make those kinds of payments? How do you take in those kinds of resources? Who signs off on that? These sorts of things. And the system really has, the people have gone out of their way to make the systems evolve so that we can do this innovative work. And absent that kind of support, we wouldn't have been able to do it. So thank you all.
AU 2030 is doing 2 quite different things. On the one hand, we're trying to take advantage of expertise that we have on campus and catalyze it to bring it all together. We see this absolutely with the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies. We are doing it also with environmental studies. We're also doing it with metropolitan studies and other areas. But AU 2030 also means that occasionally you're going to go out on a bit of a limb. And you're going to go into an area where you have absolutely no expertise at all. Jean-Paul Sartre once called the intellectual someone who speaks on that of which he has no business to speak. And I feel sometimes that this is what the dean of an arts and science dean does. I write this guy memos about p-adic equations. I have no idea what p-adic equations are. And frankly, I bet you there's nobody in this room that knows what a p-adic equation is. But the gaming is interesting because gaming really touches on everything we do. It's a kind of, it's a discipline as I to see what you're doing. You've got computer scientists like Mike. You've got folks like Lindsay. You've got incredible sort of artistic and design and conceptual leadership together. We are putting in place 4 people, minimum, 3 tenure-line people, 2 in computer science, Lindsay, School of Communication, someone in the Department of Art, who's going to be a game designer in residence. We're finding now that we're hiring, Jeff's hired someone who is going to help the gaming, even though it wasn't a game design search. That's what happens when you find a niche and you exploit it brilliantly. And let me just say how much I've enjoyed. I mean, Mike's our faculty member, so let me just say one thing about that. Not only has he helped us get the next guy in CS, he's also, I mean, can you imagine someone who's done a game on the single most traumatic week of your life? Prom week. No, but and it's been really a real treat to work with Jeff. We bring to this very different things. Jeff is actually, I'm the softly and intellectual speaking about things I know nothing about. Jeff actually knows about gaming. Jeff came here having built a game program. So he is always the cleanup hitter. And we'll pass to number 2 and number 3 and let you sort of introduce these two. But it's, I think both the School of Communication and the College of Arts and Sciences are extraordinarily proud of how far we've come. One of the things that's in common between what Eric has done, what Lindsay and Mike are doing, is leadership. And one of the things that I've seen again and again and again from these two is a real sense of where we're going in this space. So this is a treat that I think you're all going to enjoy.
Great. Yeah. Peter is so right, and I would extend the leadership kudos up the chain and mention that this is really the first time in my career as an academic entrepreneur that I've had the upfront support of the provost and the president's office. Obviously, I wasn't here 2 years ago or before 2 years ago when I came. But I wanted to just sketch out the initiative in general and then let Mike and Lindsay dive in, because Peter and I had a great first meeting. I think I'd been on the job about 4 days, and Peter had said, you know, Scott's really serious about this 80-20-30 thing. We need to get together and get moving on this. And it's been a great collaboration from the beginning. There are really 4 components to the initiative. The first is bringing in new people, and you're going to hear about and hear from these 2 wonderful new people. And I will say that through a national search last year, we simply could not have done better. We got the 2 best people, and guess what? They happen to get along incredibly well. So it's really just so fortuitous for us. The next dimension is developing academic programming. And do I have permission to mention what happened at the trustees meeting last week? Yes. So the trustees approved a Master of Arts degree in Game Design and Persuasive Play. Between CAS and SOC, and we will have our first incoming class this fall. The third piece is the creation of a studio, which is essentially it's the collection point for the energy and activity of the faculty and the students, the partners, the research that we might do, the new relationships we might build. And the studio will become, in many ways, the defining characteristic. This will be the expressive amplifier of the work of these folks and the other faculty we attract. And it will also be the attractor for the students and the partners. And the partners is really the 4th dimension of this. This opens up the door for new kinds of relationships. And I've been astounded by the enthusiasm in the DC community. There's been something of a starvation here, I think, in this particular space. And I'm not really sure why, but I'm so glad that we walked in the door and answered what clearly is a very significant need. And so part of our challenge now, I suppose, is staying in front of all this energy and attention and making sure that we harness it and do the most we can with it. But those 4 pieces are perfectly expressed, I think, in the work that these 2 fine people are doing. So Mike Trainer and Lindsay Grace. And we'll let them tell you a little bit more about your background. All you need to know from us is that they absolutely were the very best people we could possibly imagine to get. And they are just a joy to collaborate with. So I don't know how the 2 of you are going to handle it, but...
I think we're just going to split it up.
Okay, come on up. All right.
Great. Well, thank you, guys. My name is Lindsay Grace. I am the current director of the Games Initiative and our new MA program. I'm so happy to be able to say that. I'm going to speak very quickly. I'm going to do a very sort of fast presentation, both to leave time for questions and to keep you awake and energized. Okay, so I just thought I'd prep you with that. So I started making games back in 1986. This is the first game I ever made. I was very young. It was not a particularly good game, but it was my first game. It's always sort of interesting to see where things started. And I also did computer graphics back then, and I used to record them with a VHS machine and try to sell them to my friends. I have 2 degrees, 2 from Northwestern, 3 degrees rather, 2 from Northwestern, and then an MFA from the Electronic Visualization Lab at the University of Illinois, which is the place that invented the first sort of virtual reality systems. So I've got a little history there. And then I've been teaching games since 2003, so I just rounded out my first decade of teaching games. I used to be the director of the Game Center at Miami University, and that particular Game Center, which housed the undergraduate education, was a top-ranked program. So the Princeton Review ranks programs annually, and this particular program was among their honorable mentions, which puts it in the top 25 or 30 programs in the country in games. So let's talk about games. When I talk about games, people expect to see some statistics. So here are your statistics. So the first is that 58% of Americans play video games. How many of you thought that? A couple of gamers are sort of like, of course, I thought everyone did, 70%. If anyone's listening to NPR today, they actually did a whole thing on gamers and diversity. Likewise, the average age of a player is 30. So we're not just talking about 12-year-olds who happen to love Halo. And then it's a $20 billion industry. So to give you some sense of scale, years ago, maybe about 7 or 8 years ago, one of the key markers was that it outpaced the film industry and was making more money. Now we don't even talk about that. That's assumed and we're beyond that. So also when I talk about games, people expect to see slides like this. So there it is, there's your Pong, and you expect me to talk about characters like this, talk about Pac-Man, or you expect me to talk about Halo or some of these big first-person shooters that people play, or you expect to see some familiar faces like Super Mario Brothers and his friend Luigi. Little quiz there for you. Or you expect some talk about the latest mobile games, or at least their biggest successes. I probably should put Flappy Bird up here, but I put Angry Birds instead. But really, when I teach, I talk about play. Play is at the heart of everything we do in game design, so a lot of what we're doing is talking about the intersection of psychology, computer science, sociology. It really is an interdisciplinary practice, which is why, as we start this new initiative with an MA, it really is something that breaks down silos. So we have people from College of Arts and Sciences, and we have people from the School of Communications. And we'll have people from arts, etc. So I think of games as really the act of teaching games, really teaching people how to use and structure play. Psychologists have been talking about this for years, that play is a very good educator in itself. And so what we're doing is we're really teaching people how to structure play to their benefit, to a purpose. So there's lots of interesting books you can read about this, and I'm going to decant them into a couple of very easy to consume slides. These are some of my favorite authors. So I've also written about 25 articles on games and teaching, including book chapters, etc. And between those articles and my own findings, basically come to a couple of understandings. So the first is that play is a laboratory. So think about all the things that we do in creative process when we play, when we talk about theater as play. What we're doing is we're really experimenting, and that's one of the powers of play. Likewise, we understand that that play helps people understand how the world works. Play is largely about conflict resolution. I give you a challenge, and I want you to meet that challenge. You meet that challenge, I reward you, and you get a new challenge. And so what we're talking about often is about helping people understand how to deal with their own challenges. So it frames things like our understanding of real estate. How many of you have played Monopoly? Monopoly is actually the first example of what we call persuasive play. It was a game designed against landlording. So when people played Monopoly, the idea from Lizzie McGee, a female game designer, turn of the century, was that she wanted people to understand the problem with allowing people to own land. So sometimes people don't have that context when they play Monopoly. Or they help us understand really fun things like car racing, which is my hobby and a passion of mine. And they do it in interesting ways. Not only is it about understanding the physics of car racing, but it's also about understanding the machinery. So you understand the dynamics of braking and engines, etc. And you do it in a way that is engaging. So games are basically case studies. The way they're case studies is they help us understand things like finding new solutions, exciting people, fostering community, keeping people engaged, and changing their behavior and opinion. So these are some of the earliest political ads within, so there's one for Obama's campaign, within games. There's this whole category of game study called in-game advertising. And so these are some of the earliest in-game ads with political messages, and HP was also there. And then there's some more for you. So they also help us understand things like inspiring empathy. This is my classic case study for an empathy game. This is a game called Darfur is Dying, which was actually released on MTV Networks to encourage people to understand the situation in Darfur, or understanding difficult topics. So this is one of the big games of 2013. What you'll notice is I'm showing you a bunch of what we call independent games. I'm not showing you big console games for your Xbox 360, because a lot of the interesting things that are occurring are actually occurring in this space. So this game is a game where you play as a person who is responsible for figuring out who immigrates into the country. And so what's interesting about it is the gray and the ambiguity and the kinds of empathy that you develop as you're trying to experience the game. Also, improving habits. So this is a Disney game about the benefit of saving, the Great Piggy Bank Adventure. Very on point for a standard educational game. Or ask critical questions. So this is from a radical game designer, Paolo Pedercini, who puts all this practice in something called Mole Industria. And this is a game about the dark side of manufacturing smartphones to be played on smartphones. So there's this sort of interesting tension there. So much of a tension that Apple actually banned it because they found it derogatory towards their product. But it's still available for you on the Android market, because Android is a non-release market. So do with that what you will. And you can tell there's the people rushing to get their new smartphone at the non-Apple, Apple-like store.
It's a pair.
Yes, exactly, with a pair. So I think of conventional game design as this, where there's lots of people gunning for the money, there's lots of people trying to go in one space, and I'm really interested in the real impact, which is that one other space that people are executing in. And plenty of people will realize, wait, I need to follow. And that's really where we think we're going to see the most impact. So from that perspective, I have this practice I call critical gameplay. This is probably about 70 to 80% of a lot of the game production work I do. And the way critical gameplay works is that I'm trying to get people to understand new ways to play and practice. So taking the art tradition of not only, I do a lot of publications, but not only writing about the work, giving people demonstrable examples and saying, look, this will work, this can work. And so one of the easy games to understand is a game called Big Huggin'. The way Big Huggin' works is that you control the game with this fuzzy teddy bear. That's your controller. You give him big hugs. There are about 12 degrees of hugs that you can give, so little hugs, medium hugs, etc. And then it's a platformer. So think something like Mario Brothers, where you're trying to get this little bear past all his obstacles. And his obstacles might be things like rocks and rivers, or fire, or it might just be trudging through the snow. Another game that I've done through critical gameplay is a game called Wait, which the simplest way to describe it is it's a game about stopping to smell the flowers. So I've been teaching for a long time, at this point about 5 or 6 years, and I've been teaching students to make these beautiful, rich worlds. And the problem was, in most games, you just run right through them. So I wanted people to stop and appreciate them. So the way this game works is that as you move, the world disappears, but the longer you wait, the more of the world you get to see. So trees start to come in view, flowers, birds, etc. And you're rewarded for balancing seeing and doing. So if you wait too long, the world also disappears. So it's always this constant balancing act. And the game is algorithmic, so it never stops until you choose to stop it. That particular game ended up getting put in the Games for Change Hall of Fame. It's the 10th anniversary of this particular festival, which happens in New York. This year, it's actually going to be part of the Tribeca Film Festival. And they've asked me to do a workshop, I just found this out 2 days ago, at the Games for Change Festival to help people understand how to design games this way. So my particular game was one of 5 that they selected as sort of the best games in the last decade in social impact. And Papers, Please there, which is one I showed you earlier, is also there. So other games include Black White, very simple. I was thinking that a lot of games encourage stereotypes, so what if we made every character look the same? Non-player characters and player characters, and the only way you can tell the difference is by their behavior, not their appearance. So that's the way that one works. I'm actually going to skip this game in the interest of time, but tell you that ostensibly it looks like a matching game, but realistically it's actually a game about stereotype and race. You can download it to find out more. And all of these games I make in a very rapid cycle, which is part of the reason that that I think we've got some really interesting spaces to make impact. I make these games in a minimum or a maximum of a week, sometimes in a day or two, and release them out to the public or show them at these art exhibits. So there's more than 12 games in the collection now. There's about 15. And then I show them all over the world. So New York, Paris, Rio de Janeiro, and the various venues. So some computer science venues, sometimes they're completely art venues, sometimes they're independent game showcases. And then I also do a bunch of other sort of exhibits on all the other kinds of games that I make. So some games are a bit more on the artistic side, some of them are on the technical interesting side, and some of them are on the education side. So that's a game to teach Mandarin Chinese or any other language you want to learn. And so I've done that more than 35 times in the last 4 years. I also have a mobile games company, and so I make a lot of the games are sort of trivial, casual, simple games that integrate some minute or some small gesture from the critical gameplay practice. And so those games are a part of me just practicing commercial game development, making sure that things are still approachable, easy, exciting to audiences. And so you get some sense as to how they sell. This game, Penguin Roll, is probably one of the more popular ones, and on the App Store, so just the apps, the Apple side of things, it's had more than, it's ranked in the top 100 arcade games, so it's competing with things like Flappy Bird or Angry Birds. And then it's also in 12 countries, ended up as a top 500. And then this Black Like Me game, which is a lot of people don't realize, but actually has this other undertone around race and stereotype, is actually a top 20 dice game in 5 countries, including the US, and a top 100 puzzle game. And all that's just to tell you that I'm big in Chile. It's useful to understand how many people are playing these games. So from my Android side, about 847 people download a week these games, and these are very small, there's no real marketing budget for these, which is a pretty good rate. And then this big question, what is this persuasive play thing that I mentioned lightly earlier and that you kind of hear as we describe a game, or a program in a Master of Arts in Game Design and Persuasive Play? So the easiest way to understand persuasive play is to think of it as play or games that change people's interests, activities, or opinions. Just games designed to change interest, activity, or behavior. So if you think about it this way, the games that I'm showing you in critical gameplay are games that are designed to help people see another way to play, ideally to get them to play differently. And so that's what we're interested in. As part of the initiative that we've launched, we're producing a game studio, so we'll have students, faculty, and some professionals developing games that meet these criteria, that are goal-oriented, purpose-driven play. And so there's sort of 2 sides to the initiative. There's the Persuasive Play Studio, as mentioned, and then there's a proposed MA, which I didn't know if I could say much about, so all I have for you on this slide is the fact that it's entitled Game Design and Persuasive Play, and it's 2 years, 36 hours. It's a pretty interesting, exciting curriculum that I think offers the ability, and I want to emphasize this, for the students in this MA program to take electives in other programs. We want to educate people across disciplines, and we want to educate people without these silos. And so the program is structured to encourage people to take film courses, or art courses, or Latin Studies courses. And so part of that is very unique for a lot of these programs. So I think that's going to be one of our very cool things. So the kinds of games that these folks will be teaching, or that will be teaching and that people will be designing, include what we call social impact play. So there's games like Darfur is Dying, as I showed you. And then generally persuasive play, which is a pretty big category of games designed to change interest, activities, and behaviors, or interest, activities, and opinions. And then news games. So because we can produce these games so quickly, we can actually do something that has been very hard before, which is have games about news that has occurred recently. So one of the things I've talked to people about is the idea that we can produce games that are editorial commentary. So instead of looking at an editorial comic, you can play an editorial game, where you can understand a new perspective on something that was just released yesterday. And then also alternative play, so just helping people understand all of the other ways they can play and being a kind of pioneer in that space. As an example, I made this game in less than a day to promote our move to McKinley, the SOC's move to McKinley. And so we just took the, I just took the floor plans and let you ride this AU puck across the floor to get to specific classrooms. So it's kind of a way of learning the space. And you actually take your mobile device and rotate it in order for it to work. It's not just touch. We've also done things like the Global Game Jam. We had 52 people come to campus to build a game in a weekend. And so these are all the people. And this is, amazingly, the Sunday. So they've already not slept for more than 40 hours or so, and they are still able to raise their arms. So these are dedicated people. There are about 10 students, and the rest of the people are coming from the outside community. So as Dean Rutenbeck mentioned, there's a real hunger in DC for more of this participation. So that was really great. In March, we're doing a diversity summit. We've invited some folks down to talk about how we can address the concerns around diversity within games. So we're going to do two things. We're going to have both a talk, and Mike Trainer's here, the slide cut off. So it's Mike and I, Chirich as a faculty member, Boris, who does dancing in games, which is interesting own space, and then Damon Brown has written a couple of books on games. And we're just going to try and encourage people to sort of talk, and we're going to, in the middle of it, do a small game jam. So we're actually going to try and design board games around these topics to start encouraging people towards a new perspective. So again, persuasive play integrated into a summit. And that's all to tell you that persuasive play is on its way to AU. That's all I have.
We've been exploring the role of simulations, games, avatars and the like in assessment, and we can discuss that at all as a role. How do you see that, and how do you see it playing out?
So there's terrific potential there, and one of the challenges right now that I think everyone in the sort of game space is talking about is that we need to be better at assessing. There's such a eagerness to make games that we just sort of make them and then send them out and don't ask the key questions about, well, how much did that change someone's opinion, or how much did that affect the way they view their everyday world? And it's a tough question to answer, but I love that, that we've been trying to initiate a couple conversations with people who are very good at assessing and have that history, so that we can be one of the first groups, institutions in that space.
I was actually referring to using the simulation, the play, to assess how people think, behave, and using it as an assessment tool to gather information which can't be studied for, or can't have a strategy.
Yep. So there's been some good research in there. The fundamental challenge is always that if we understand play, one of the tricks with play is that if you are good at play, you're constantly finding borders. So the challenge in making a good game in that space is that you have to make sure that you are doing a realistic assessment. So if I give you the opportunity to do anything in this room and I say it's a game, you may do things that are completely illogical to find the borders of that experience. So a lot of people who are designing these simulations are trying to make sure they are still playful experiences, but they have to confine them, and in confining them, sometimes they turn them into quizzes. So I was giving an example, a researcher at Northwestern who does research in psychology is working with me. He invited me to do a game forum around STDs and understanding what to do to prevent bad or behavior that encourages contracting STDs. And one of the things that I was trying to help him understand is that in order to make the game interesting, we're going to have to allow play. But the problem is if you allow too much play, then the simulation breaks down, because it's more fun to do the things you would never do than it is to do the things that you should do. And so the challenge in most of that from the design perspective is making sure that you give enough play for it to be fun without making it a quiz. So one of the games that I sort of spec'd for him when I did a bunch of designs, it was a game that effectively, in my mind, is a quiz, because there's only a right answer and a wrong answer, and that's not particularly playful unless you structure it correctly. So that's the big design challenge in making those simulations, but they are wonderful when they're executed well.
I'll have an answer for that.
Great.
Yeah, with the context.
Oh, perfect. That's right. Yeah. Any other questions? All right.
All right. So, hello, I'm Mike Trainer. I'm a new faculty here in computer science as of August, and I'm happily part of this game design persuasive play MA, which is officially happening. I think my talk's going to be a little more research oriented in a way. I'm going to problematize some of the ways that we think about games, and then talk about the role of game researchers in trying to make new types of playable experiences that might change the way we see the world. So let's start with this here. Chris Crawford is one of these earliest game designers who was really interested in making games that change the world. And he is very excited that games constitute a new and as yet poorly developed art form that holds great promise for designers and players. And I think that same optimism I certainly have, Lindsay has, and the school is demonstrating. And it's new because games combine the moving image, they combine audio, and this great promise is like, we can make games about the systems we live in. How cool would that be? You know, we're not just going to watch a movie, we're going to make an interactive experience. Okay, so great, I agree. So how have we done? So here's a game that people, gamers, hold up as a triumph. It's this game called BioShock. It is, the gameplay is critiquing objectivism, Ayn Rand's philosophy, because it takes place in this dystopia world where everything's gone to hell, and you slowly through the story learns of, a whole big thing. But at the point, it's telling a story, and people are excited. Like, look, there's a game that's critiquing a philosophy. How cool is that? But I argue, and I think you can see with this next slide here, BioShock, that's a very optimistic way to describe what BioShock's about, because the gameplay is a game about running around, holding weird weapons, and shooting zombies in the face. And so if you look at the experience, about 90% of it is running around shooting zombies, and about 10% of it is watching cutscenes that, in my opinion, very crudely critique a philosophy, right? So that's not too exciting. So now on the more educational game side, or a more recent example, this is a game called Global Conflicts. And it's a game where you're a reporter and you explore these various worlds that maybe you wouldn't know, and you ask people questions in order to learn about some sort of conflict in an area. And the goal is like, hey, look, we're making a video game that's about exploring other cultures and learning about the current events of areas that normal gamers would never look at. Now, I think that I'm not too excited about that either. And the reason is because the gameplay is about walking around and clicking on people which reveal like handwritten dialogue. And it's not clear to me exactly how it's that the gameplay is important to the experience. It's not a whole lot different than, say, watching a reporter talk about interview people and so sit back and watch a reporter interview somebody. In a sense, actually, the gameplay is almost just like making the experience, like adding sugar to the experience, right? So now, maybe if we give this to kids and call it a game, they will now want to read the stuff that they never want to pay attention to otherwise. So now gameplay is the vehicle to try to sell people to have some experience they wouldn't do anyway. Okay, so returning to this statement, nice optimistic statement, I would emphasize that the problem is it's a poorly developed art form. I do think it has a whole lot of potential for the future, and I think it's the role of academics and perhaps independent game developers to develop this art form. The game industry is very conservative because every time they make a game, it's like expecting Michael Bay to make the newest art film that's going to push, push the medium forward. I think it's the role of academics to help discover the stuff. So I think the primary problem, and my research is focused on, is that we don't know the answer to this question exactly. So what does it mean for a game to be about something? We want to make games that are about aspects of reality and help us understand how to live in the systems we live in. And I've just shown that layering it in cutscenes, like in BioShock, is inadequate, and then making these simple click all over the screen and read chunks of text is also not working. So I think the problem is there are two systems of meaning in games that are operating all the time, and this is where we get into trouble. So the first is games are made, they're full of assets, right? And by that I mean data. These are the type of things that we're used to, more traditional art forms are. So, a painting, once you make it, there it is, it exists. Of course, its cultural context matters, blah, blah, but in terms of the thing that you're creating, you lovingly arrange every single stroke to make some painting, or if you edit a movie, you're controlling exactly every single cut, and you're lovingly handcrafting it. Where games introduce this whole other thing, which is very confusing, is that what they're about also involves the rules. What do you do? How does the system react to what you do? And so, on the right we have this rule system of Agricola, which is one of the more crazy German board games that's popular. And then you implement it in code. And so now our loving handcrafting of particular artistic experiences now becomes about lovingly handcrafting generators of experiences, which is what game rules are. We need to make it so when the player pokes the game, it responds in some way, right? And I think that that's where we just, like, whoa, like, we don't know what to do. So, this can be looked at. Evidence of this is shown in 2 examples. So here's another Darfur game, actually more recent. On the Ground Reporter in Darfur shows an example of, how was I going to say this? An example of, I guess, symptoms of this problem, not knowing game rules. So what they have done is they've created this game, which is about, very similar to Global Conflicts, where you are trying to learn about some foreign area you don't know very well. And you give simple answers to questions, which will show a very nice, like, recorded cutscene. They have this very nice live motion presentation. But you could kind of look at the underlying setup of what's going on in the design of this game is a very simple, like, dialogue tree. Every single interaction point is literally pre-authored by the designers of this game. So it's like you start there and you click go, now you get a choice and you move over to hello. And ultimately, each piece of this is one of these static assets, these lovingly handcrafted video pieces, right? So the interactivity part of it isn't what makes this experience about what it's about, right? The interactivity is supporting the static assets, which can work. I mean, this isn't bad. Like, this is great. Cool. So what might that mean? Let me point out why this is a problem a little bit. So you guys know what these are? Choose Your Own Adventure books, right? These are also a representation of this kind of thing, right? Where you read a chunk of text and then it says, oh, do you fall into the manhole or do you turn the other way? Go to page whatever, whatever. So that you could imagine it as one of these graphing structures. So not all games are like this, though. Like, I just explained that Darfur game is every path is pre-authored. There are, as a funny demonstration of how all games, of another way to go if you're going to create games, consider this. This is Pong, right? But it's Pong realized as a choose your own adventure. So here, someone actually made this book, which it presents a bunch of pictures, and it says, so you control this. If you want to go up, go to page 114. If you want to go down, go to page 117. Let's go to page 117. Where is it? Boop. Okay, I've now moved down a little bit, and the ball is a little closer to me, right? So clearly this isn't, so this is not how Pong actually works. This is just a hilarious, absurd example of what it would be like to hand author every state in Pong. Pong is actually supported by a simple simulation of 2D physics, right? It's actually a really weird one. The angles of where the ball hits, it doesn't reflect according to reality, and they have this one. Anyway. So there's this other way of moving forward, which is we can have these models that kind of generate the next state, right, every frame. And that's what Pong does. It is able to, based on your input, move this thing up with a velocity, and if the ball collides with it, it provides some reaction. So other games that try to be meaningful, that they don't try to author every state, are like, say, this. This is a popular game, serious game called Remission. This was made to help educate children with cancer about their condition. And you can kind of look at this. I mean, clearly they didn't hand author every state. This is like a 3D world where you look over the shoulder of this thing, and you're shooting cancer cells, brain cancer cell, and you shoot. It's kind of ridiculous, right? Like this playable experience is kind of like that BioShock thing, where like it's a game about running around shooting things, but on the surface they're telling you it's about treating cancer and you're learning about it. When in fact the educational content is in the form of cutscenes, just like BioShock. And just as a funny example, it looks a lot like this game if you kind of think about the gameplay. It's about looking over someone's shoulder and shooting things, right? Kind of fun. Okay, so what do we do? So there's a problem, and I think it is the job of education, or academics, and people who can afford to take these risks to develop new ways out of this to make good on this, like, I think, a very exciting future of games. So we need to develop what it means to make games about subjects meaningfully. And that's where the interactivity has to do with what the game is actually about. So one way to look at the state of games is, so this is the space of all possible games that could ever be made. right? What we've essentially done is these are little islands of explored areas. We've looked a lot at what you might want to call hypertext almost, right? Like hand-authored, linked, dynamic cutscenes, or physics, right? Every game's essentially about running around or jumping or clicking through a hypertext scene, right? And it makes you wonder, what else is out there, right? What other types of models might support gameplay that aren't about running or jumping or clicking? So this is what my research is aimed at doing, trying to explore this space. And I truly do believe it's bigger than this. Like, it is just such an exciting area. So the first example, and let's see my time. I'll scope my example here. Okay, so my first example is a game that I was a lead designer and developer on called Prom Week. And this is a game where we set out to make a game where the interaction was meaningfully about a theory of social interaction. We wanted this game to actually reflect the complex social system that we work in, or a particular one. And so the gameplay, just to describe, is you choose what social interactions one character takes with another. It's the week before the prom, and the scene is full of potential drama. Once you choose a social interaction, they walk over and they have a little dialogue cutscene with each other, right? The reason why they want to take certain actions with one another and the ways in which they respond to one another is determined by a very, very sophisticated social simulation. And in fact, every character at any given time has over 5,000 social considerations about every other character. And I'll tell you what I mean by that for a second. Yeah, I should say this game had a lot of, it was very successful. It was nominated for Independent Games Festival, which is probably the biggest game festival around, and IndieCade is another very large one. It also has been very influential in the game industry, just from people and unannounced projects and things like that. Great, so that's a few examples of what I'm going to argue is that this game is an example of a game that comes from a different island in my space of games. And I'm trying to figure out my right level of resolution to go in, so I might skip through some slides. Okay, so it's an example of there's a different kind of system under the hood. It's not about hypertext jumping around. It's not about physics. In fact, you might even call it's a social physics engine. That's how I kind of tried to think of it. I'm not going to describe the details, but this is computer science research. But the game could have never existed. In fact, we could have never imagined the game if it was not supported by this computational model. So we went out with this goal, to create a game that was about social interaction, that wasn't about, like, if I'm enemies with you, that means you hate me no matter what. But we wanted to get across the idea that social reality is very complicated. We have contradictory ideas about each other. We're influenced by far-reaching and unexpected things we've heard and all that. And then fundamentals, an individual's social behavior is determined from the accumulation of many minor considerations. And this was founded in research in sociology. Part of the methodology that I do is I kind of probably walk, as you were talking about, Dean Starr, walk into areas where I'm not experienced and read some of the literature and, okay, great, let's just make an AI system that implements that book. And so that's kind of the starting point for a lot of the work I do. There is precedent for this. This is what AI used to be until, for a long time, this was how AI existed. And it's kind of a resurgent now that games are more involved in artificial intelligence research. Great. Fundamental to it is we came up with, I'm just going to move through that, more system. Blah, blah, blah. So I said characters have social considerations. Here's an example of just 3 that are kind of interesting. If 2 people are friends, you might be a little more likely to be nice to them. If you're friends with somebody and you have a crush on someone else, and then your friend was romantic to your crush, you're gonna be like, whoa! Like, you're a little more likely to be mean to them. But that's just that's just the second of 5,000 of these things. And then they can get pretty complicated too, where I call this the knight in shining armor, right here. If you have high romance towards somebody, some other person's mean to you, and then that person, soon after that, is mean to, no, excuse me. You see what's going on. I wrote all these rules, it was crazy. You have high romance towards somebody, someone else is mean to you, but then that person is mean to them. It's like they stood up for you, right? And so you are a little more likely to want to date them or something like that. Okay, cool. It's grounded, there's a templated system that they use to talk to each other, which is actually pretty dynamic. We do a lot of text generation, so things get filled in, and this I thought was a really nice solution, but I can't go into it. So I should say, SIF is the name of the AI system that was under the hood. It enabled the prom week game, that research. SIF has been used on a very large EU-funded project. It is at the core of a very, very large DARPA project that I worked on for a while. And it is at the core, like I said, unannounced commercial products. So I really think that kind of research has a lot of payoff. Another thing that I'll go over very briefly is I have this humanities side to me, where I am very interested in game interpretation. So this is another project. It's game-o-matic. Game-o-matic takes a network of nouns and verbs as input, like this, and then it'll generate games for you. This is an example of a news game like Lindsay was talking about that Game-O-Matic did not make, but it was a critique of early 2000s US foreign policy where you're controlling this figure from Guernica, and when you collide with bombs, you die, and if you collide with food, you get to keep playing. Through playing the game, you always lose very quickly. So it was just a nice pointed critique of it makes no sense to drop bombs and food on the same. So Game-O-Matic, you could kind of generate your own version of this early 2000 thing by saying USA makes food, USA makes bombs, it makes food, civilian needs food, but bombs kill civilian, right? So this is the input to the system. And then Game-O-Matic, and using its little AI model of metaphorical game mechanic meaning, it develops the civilian game. It's about a game about where you control these kids. You're trying to collect food. So there's food over here, but these bombs are flying out of the USA, right? And so you're just trying to get over there and avoid bombs. And because it's a generator, you can just click go and you get a different one. So here's one where you're trying to get the star, you're constantly shrinking, you need to collide with the food in order to grow again, and likewise the bombs hurt you. Yeah. So this is a system which I made a playable experience about, this is a little high level, but about exploring how game mechanics are metaphorical, right? And it was enabled by creating an AI system that's able to generate an experience. And in current research, I'm working on ideological modeling. So like, how can you make ideology playable? Like, what would that game be about? I'm not talking about running around and jumping on people you don't like. What would that mean to be playing with this kind? The game mechanics are tweaking this kind of stuff. And if you want to collaborate, this is current research. So come talk to me. And so games about ideology. So in conclusion, I think that in order to move games forward, we need new theoretical tools, computational models, and design techniques, because we want to make good on this promise that games started off with, right? Or that I started with, right? That games can be transformative, high impact. All right, that's it. And thank you.
Questions? Comments?
I have to run, but it seems to me that the opportunity of creating puzzles using the game structure, puzzles that are mysteries, that raise ethical questions when you're creating a series of dilemmas which there are no right or wrong, but it's how you choose among different bad choices. What's the most ethical choice among bad choices? Because that's real life is complex.
Yeah.
There are multiple pathways that create the different outcomes in terms of a life path, life course. It seems to me that creating complex puzzles that are interesting to do could be used to provide insight to how people judge and make choices that are either, it could be an ethical domain, it can be in terms of cognitive processing. It can be non-cognitive domains, persistence, determination. It just seems to me there's a whole realm of, in the more psychodynamic range, that would be available in terms of how you analyze someone's choices in play or in solving puzzles.
Yeah, so I can respond to that and to sort of the question you asked before because about assessment. Okay, to me, I think that in order to assess player choice, you need to have an actual model that reflects what their choice actually meant under the hood in some way, right? And so the problem with branching games, where the thing you're choosing between something that looks good or something that looks evil, all you know about their choice is they chose this or that, right? It's not a conflict, there's not a, the context isn't captured at all, right? And so I think that if you had a model of ethical reasoning, some model, of course it's problematic, because models are always problematic, you could actually make some really interesting assessments of how people make choices in games.
And not only can you assess, you can generate new knowledge, which is the really exciting part.
No, you can learn from
Right.
the way you play. Thank you.
Question?
So I'll preface this by saying I've played Angry Birds maybe twice, and that's it as far as my gaming experience goes. I was wondering, how much of this allows for numerous people to play towards a sort of a collaborative solution, as opposed to being a one person playing a game?
Yeah, so we're in a historical anomaly here that single-player games are so popular. Like, how weird are single-player games? You need a computer for all, not really unique cards, but there are people who explore collaborative games in the analog game space, like board games and card games. There's a lot. In fact, most game designers are excited about those type of games because that's where it's very interesting, right?
And also, can those lead to sort of crowdsourced solutions to problems? Or,
Well, so that too, there is a human...
Human computation games is an area, I've done some publications in it. The short version is that you can actually get people to solve problems for which people are very well suited, but computers aren't. So it's a good complement to exactly what he's talking about, because sometimes you can't code all the complexities into a database or into a model. So what you do instead is you say people have a lot of heuristic data. They've learned a lot in their years of existence that we don't want to recode a computer, we'll just have them solve the problem. And then Mike's stuff does an awesome job of extending the potential for that.
Yeah. Questions?
So this reminds me an awful lot of social practice art, right?
Okay.
So, which is, if I try to use game language, it would be the artist goes into a domain, or actually layers of multiple domains, community, and tries to create something called art that is relevant to the people and perhaps even also interactive with the people who are there. So you can kind of think of community practice.
Yeah, I'm actually familiar with this now, yeah.
Right,
Just making
right.
sure it was what I thought it was.
So one of the things that I'm trying to grapple with is the concept of domain relevance and how to orient the artist or the practitioner towards this idea that some of those domains are overlapping, so it could be that it's a community who's fundamentally interested in poverty, or experiences poverty in a fundamental way. Also tightly knit versus loosely oriented towards each other, and maybe has some aesthetic matter that they deal with, like it's a very green place. It's like lots of trees or something. And then how to help the practitioner understand, first of all, how to see that world, how to interpret that world, and then how to engage in it in meaningful ways using artistic tools to result in something that's meaningful to
the community that they were put into.
Yes. Can games help me?
Can games help you with that?
Yeah.
I mean, that has a lot to do with a lot of my non-computer science work, game interpretation. I mean, that's, game is meaningful in context. And so part of the, actually, part of the goal or thing you need to do when you release a game is release it to somewhere where it can be meaningful. So if you're trying to affect a community, you should know something about that community. So I have a lot of sympathy with what you're saying.
Yes?
Now, is that a special, that feels like an application of, you put a game artist in a social situation.
Kind of.
But would games help you do it? Is that what you're asking?
I'm trying to think like, here's where my imagination is going. If we could identify some sense of the domains of relevance, so you can't account for everything that might be important to that community, but you can get some sort of bigger picture things, then could an artist use that as sort of a simulation environment to think about what are some of the artistic methods that could work in that place? Because when we send artists out into those spaces, it's very high risk. Because they're actual people dealing with actual people on the ground for whom this experience either works or doesn't. And very often the only way you get that practice is by doing it unsuccessful with real life human beings. So is there a way
So there is a training simulator that I've worked on before that is actually built out of the core AI in the Promenade game. It's even another development on that, which is a cultural training simulator for unknown cultures for nonverbal communication. So it's this very particular thing, but the idea is they wanted to have a very complex model of an unknown culture. It's not like a specific one. It was actually a generated culture, which was kind of neat. And the goal was to promote being a good stranger in an area. So this sounds like military, as it is. And so you could imagine if you had some sort of model, some model of some environment, but that would be hard. You could make these interesting, playful, nice playing grounds to help train somebody to understand how to go into an unknown, touchy area, right? So maybe they'll screw up in the game first or something. And Lindsay had a good point that just behaving good in a training simulator doesn't mean that you've learned the lesson. In fact, people who screw around in training simulators are probably learning the lesson more.
Okay.
Right?
That's one of the hardest things for people to understand from the outside is that a lot of what makes game design effective is that border pushing, and that's what helps people understand. So again, back to Mike's work, what's really great is that he has complex systems. They're not one or the other. They're not quizzes that are just true-false questions. They're actually play spaces with rich sets of rules that allow you to learn through that space if you structure them well. It's one of the, in my own opinion, it's one of the spaces that educational games hasn't really explored effectively. They've been so sort of used to standard assessment models and true-false models and sort of multiple choice questions that the games end up mimicking that machinery instead of executing on something that's much more complex, as you described. And I can talk to you about critical design later, because I think that'll answer some of the question.
Okay.
So I'll stick around, how about that? Because we're over time.
Absolutely, and we've brought more food out, so do stick around, all of
Excellent.
you, and talk with each other. I want to thank all of our presenters for coming today, and there may even be some possibilities of interactions among the two sets. Thank you all very much, and on behalf of the library, we're delighted to host you for these at any time.
Thank you.